My second game for December is Spacewar, a little game from 1985, which somehow managed to sneak its way onto a lot of people's computers, through bulletin boards and other means. But it has a huge history. If you get any number of computer scientists together into a room and ask them how computer games started, you'll get any number of answers back. But in these enlightened times, we usually consider OXO in about 1950 to have been one of the first games. It was designed on one of these gigantic machines that came out at the end of the Second World War. To play, you had to stand in front of a big light board and write the word OXO in lights. Fast forward about 8 years and computers had improved to the point that you could actually fit them inside normal rooms. And Tennis for Two was developed, where you had to use an oscilloscope screen and a couple of controllers to move a ball and bat it backwards and forwards across a little net. Then 1 year later, the Digital Equipment Corporation came out with the PDP-1, the first attempt to actually move computers into the proper office space. And this chap, Stephen Russell, wrote a game called Spacewar. Spacewar was incredibly popular, and it went through a number of iterations. In fact, it was so popular that DEC themselves included Spacewar in their own marketing material in 1963 to advertise the PDP-1. Now, there were a lot of people were using PDP-1s, and it went through a number of iterations, and then eventually on the PDP-7, two chaps called Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, yes, that Dennis Ritchie of Kernighan and Ritchie, were playing a lot of Spacewar, and they were writing their own games. One of them they wrote was called Space Travel, where you had to fly around the solar system and land on various planets, a little bit like Kerbal Space Program, but with vector graphics. Some people say that Ken Thompson himself was so enamored with Spacewar and really wanted it, he started writing his own operating system. And in fact, to write his own operating system, he had to write his own language. And eventually he wrote Unix and C. And again, some people say that he wrote those specifically so that he could play Spacewar on the PDP-11 system, which you can see them standing in front of there. At the same time, another little known chap called Nolan Bushnell was looking at Spacewar and decided that he wanted to get into computer games, and eventually ended up setting up a small company called Atari. And as they say, the rest is history. However, we're going to talk about Spacewar. And this is Spacewar, or at least a modern recreation of it, built into the browser. It allows two players to play, much as they did back in the 1950s, 1960s. It even simulates the phosphor persistence, because the screens back in the day, they didn't need to be 60 Hz super fast refresh. In fact, on an oscilloscope screen, it's more worthwhile if it can persist for a little while so that you can see the history of the trace, which produces a really nice effect, especially when you start zooming past the star that's in the middle, which exerts a bit of a gravitational pull. Now, it has to be understood that this was pretty much one of the only games that was available for anyone at the time, and with such well-defined gameplay loop, allowing people to play games and learn how the physics and the mechanics work, slingshot around the star, launch torpedoes, get it just right, and you can see how people could become really quite good. Fast forward 30 years, and in 1988 a young me is sitting in front of his parents' new PC, absolutely hating it because it's not an Atari ST or an Amiga or an Archimedes. But we've just returned back from a disk duplicator who's copied a bunch of public domain disks. One of the public domain disks I chose was a games compilation, and one of the games on it was called Spacewar because it had 8 characters in its name. It fit perfectly into the DOS naming convention, and it was fairly obvious it was a sci-fi game, and I was into Star Trek, so I was really looking forward to it. But completely oblivious to its 30-year history, I started playing it and absolutely fell in love. It's a pretty good recreation of the PDP original, with a few upgrades. You now have 2 different ways to attack. You have phasers and torpedoes. You can turn the planet on and off. You can turn the gravity on and off. And crucially, you can actually get the computer to play one or both of the opponents. What is interesting, in a nod to future X-Wing games, is that you have energy balancing. Once your shield starts to take a hit, you can actually start to transfer energy out of your engines, move it into the shields in order to bolster your shields, which might potentially make your lasers fire less often. But of course, the story doesn't end with Spacewar. After Spacewar came Star Control, and then Star Control 2, and Star Control 3, and the new Star Control. But it set the scene for most of the multiplayer games which came after it. And in a true way, it was a trailblazer, and this is probably the reason why most people consider it to be the first true computer game. And as you can see, it's been ported to many other systems with lots of variants with different names, and its DNA lives on. The format that it laid down for multiplayer games lives on, even to this day,